Hello, my name is James Robson, and I'm the Victor and William Fung Director of the Harvard Asia Center. The Asia Center's Author Conversation series is aimed at highlighting insightful engagements with authors of books published recently by the Asia Center Publications Program and other publishers on topics of interest to the Asia Center's mission of fostering research on Asia in transnational and transregional perspectives. We very much hope you enjoy the conversations. Hi, my name is James Robson. I'm the Victor and William Fung Director of the Harvard Asia Center, and we are excited to be hosting the three co-editors of the recently published volume, Ruling by Other Means, State-Mobilized Movements, published by Cambridge University Press just recently in 2020. And this is part of the Asia Center's Author Conversation series. So today I'm joined by Professor Grzegorz Ekiert, who is the Laurence A. Tisch Professor of Government at Harvard University and the Director of the Minda D. Gunzburg Center for European Studies, and also a Senior Scholar at the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies. At the Center for European Study, he co-chairs the Seminar on Democracy, Past, Present, and Future. Professor Ekiert's research and teaching interests focus on comparative politics, regime change and democratization, civil society and social movements, and Eastern European politics and societies. In addition to this volume, his books include The State Against Society, Political Crisis and Their Aftermath in East Central Europe, published by Princeton University Press in 1996, and also Rebellious Civil Society, Popular Protests and Democratic Consolidation in Poland, co-authored with Jan Kublik, published by the University of Michigan Press in 1999. Also joining us today is Professor Elizabeth J. Perry, who is the Henry Rosovsky Professor of Government at Harvard University and the current director of the Harvard-Yenching Institute. She is former president of the Association for Asian Studies and also the former director of Harvard's Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. Her research focuses on the history of the Chinese Revolution and its implications for contemporary Chinese politics. And she is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a corresponding fellow of the British Academy. Professor Perry is the author of Shanghai on Strike, The Politics of Chinese Labor, published by Stanford University Press in 1993, received the John King Fairbanks Prize of the American Historical Association. Finally, we're also joined by Professor Xiaojun, all the way from Hong Kong, and he is an associate professor and currently in the politics and public administration at the University of Hong Kong and the director of the Research Hub on Institutions of China at Hong Kong University. He obtained his bachelor's and master's degrees from Peking University and his master's and PhD in political science from Harvard University. He is a specialist of comparative political science and the politics of China, and he has authored a number of books and articles which have appeared in the Journal of Contemporary China, the China Quarterly, and Dr. Yan was the recipient of the 2012 Gordon White Prize by the China Quarterly for his research on new entrepreneurial party secretaries in rural China. So thank you all very much for joining me here today for this interview about your book, Ruling by Other Means. And I was thinking, since this is such an innovative collection of essays that really transcends all national boundaries and covers countries scattered throughout the world, I thought it might be important to begin to hear a little bit about how this volume came to be in terms of bringing together scholars who work on radically different parts of the world, but are focusing on this single issue of state-mobilized movements. So if you could give a little background on just how you brought these scholars together for this volume, that would be a nice way to start.
Thank you very much, James. First of all, let me, on behalf of all three editors, express our appreciation to the Asia Center for your support when we were working on the conferences that led to this volume. So we're deeply appreciative of that. In the end, there were fewer Asian cases than we had anticipated. We had a couple of people drop out along the way, unfortunately, but we still do have a number of chapters that are focused on Asia, 2 on the PRC, 1 on Taiwan, 1 on Hong Kong. And we make a number of other references to Japan, South Korea, and India throughout the volume. So Asia is certainly there, although not quite as prominent as we had originally anticipated. Probably each of the 3 editors will have somewhat different takes on how this volume originated, but let me give my own by way of introduction. As far as I can recall, it really first came out of a seminar in the Harvard Government Department that Professor Ekiert and I were co-teaching on contentious politics and social movements. Grzegorz, as you mentioned, is an expert on Poland and Eastern Europe. I work on China. And so those cases were quite prominent in our course. And we realized in the course of teaching it that the theories that are mainstream in the study of contentious politics and social movements couldn't really capture the nature of many of these top-down movements that we were looking at in our particular cases. And that was especially true when we came to the case of China, where we focused on the Cultural Revolution. One of the most important examples of contentious politics in the 20th century, and yet one which in many ways began from the top and only later was joined from the social side, whereas our social movement theories generally begin with society, the notion of different grievances and conflicts within society battling against the state. And so Grzegorz and I talked about how we might think about this, and we wanted to include scholars who were focusing on other parts of the world to get their take on it. We had a number of discussions of the extent to which these top-down state-mobilized movements were unique to authoritarian, non-democratic contexts, or the extent to which they were common to all different kinds of regime types. And we settled on an understanding that, in fact, all regimes tend to resort to these in one way or another, although they may be more common, more pronounced in non-democratic regimes. But of course, living in the United States under the Trump administration with his campaign rallies and so forth, we've also seen a good deal of this sort of state-mobilized movement here in the United States in recent years as well. So I'll let my co-editors speak. I think the way in which we came together as a trio of editors here has to do with Grzegorz having spent some time at the University of Hong Kong and been in discussions with Professor Xiaojun there about what we might do together, and having had these previous conversations that perhaps we do something on state-mobilized movements, we then drew in the University of Hong Kong and Xiaojun's colleagues as well. But let me turn to Grzegorz and then Xiaojun to add their comments.
I think I fully recognize the way you phrased that, how it was, what was the origin of our project. But I think I would like to emphasize just two small things. So first of all, in connection to teaching. I think this is very important, right? That graduate seminar was a kind of review course of what has been going on in the field of contention and social movement and so on, and our examination of those issues together with the discussions we had with students and focusing on the range of empirical cases clearly showed to us that there are some things missing in the existing literature. So I think good research projects, one could say, always sort of come up with this intense teaching experience when you try to convey to a younger generation of scholars what the older generation had accomplished, and then suddenly you find out that there are some holes in this legacy. So that's the one point I wanted to emphasize. Now the second point of course, is about scholarly exchanges. I think, it is obvious to us in this current pandemic situation how lonely and kind of shut off the larger academic community we are. And I think, the personal contact, the personal exchanges between universities, between colleagues, not only conferences, but really longer stays in specific places are really the fertile ground for coming up with new ideas and with new projects and so on. So that's important. I hope that we will come back to this mode of academic exchange in not such a long period of time. And finally, I would like to emphasize that this is a project which focuses on a substantive issue. So, it's an issue-driven project. This is not a project on region. This is not a project on country. This is not a project, as sometimes you see, that a bunch of people get together and sort of, contribute a number of chapters which had not exactly much in common. But this was designed from the ground up as exploration of a specific issue done by scholars who have a very different regional expertise. And I think from that point of view, this project worked quite well.
Mm-hmm.
Xiaojun?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, James. And I think both Liz and Grzegorz have already said the experiences from which this volume came out. I just want to add, I completely agree with them. I just want to add one point is that when I first talked with Grzegorz about the state-mobilized movement, one thing came up to my mind is also what we see in the local politics in Hong Kong during the Occupy Central movement. Because from 2014, we can see in the Hong Kong political scene, there are a sort of a sudden flourishing of patriotic organizations or patriotic social movements. And my conversation with my colleagues, one of them also contributed a chapter to this book. From those conversations, we also found that the state increasingly are using the so-called state-mobilized movement as a countermeasure against the social mobilization initiated by the civil society. And later on, when we talk about this, we also found that state mobilization itself might play other roles as well, like in the volunteer movement, which is a campaign aiming at public service, on which a chapter is also included in this book, written by one of my colleagues in the sociology department at Hong Kong U. In this kind of state mobilization, the state used state-mobilized movement to initiate its own sort of agenda in public service. And back to history, we also find that the state might also use state mobilization to advocate its developmental agendas. So this is sort of such a rich scene of state mobilization. So we found that the traditional social movement theory might only tell half of the story, while the other half of the story is state mobilized.
Actually, this I think leads into a really natural next question, which primarily I think comes out in the very first chapter written by Professor Perry and Professor Ekiert on state-mobilized movements, a research agenda, which, but it also comes up in many of the other essays where the authors make reference to or claims about how this volume overturns or forces us to rethink a lot of the classical theories, or what many of you just described. Actually, all three of you, I think, used the phrase traditional theories and things like that. And how this volume is really challenging some of those in terms of larger social movements or large protest movements and all of that. So perhaps we could begin there just with a very clear sense, or trying to get a clearer sense of just what exactly are the main theories that are being overturned or challenged through this volume, and particularly the focus on these state-mobilized movements.
Okay. So, thinking about our conversation last night, I thought that probably making this more visual would be helpful. So let me try the screen and see whether you can see that. Now, this looks a little bit complicated, but I think it really shows the research which has been done in the field of contentious politics and protests over the last several decades. So, those four circles you have are what I call the arenas or domains of protest and contention. And most of the research has been done on various elements or various domains during the last several decades. So let me quickly go through those domains. There's a domains of infrapolitics, which is known from a famous work of James Scott, much of which has been done in East Asia, showing the everyday form of resistance people employ in a situation of political oppression. Then there's another domain which can be called grassroots politics or social movement politics, with weekly institutionalized cases of mobilization happening in many different societies, both democratic and non-democratic. Then we have a domain which can be called the civil society politics or the civil society domain, in which we have institutional organizations, various NGOs and various other social organizations, which are very often involved in protest and contention. And finally, we have something which we are all very familiar with. This is the formal politics with elections, campaigns, electoral rallies, and protests, and so on. The traditional theory of social movements, and I will draw your attention to this red line, somehow looked at the left side of the story. And major assumption behind it was that all the social movements and civil society organizations are springing up from the social domains and social networks, and their main function is to challenge the state, challenge the formal actors. So movement politics was non-state, or civil society politics was non-state, and then state was on the other side of the red boundary. What we are doing in this volume really is what you see in this yellow triangle. We are trying to explore how the state enters the domain of civil society and movement politics, and how the state is trying to mobilize social movements and protest to accomplish some state-defined goals. So I think that's where the innovation is. We are not rejecting the research which has been done in the past, but what we are doing, we are simply exploring another dimension of contention and movement activities, which somehow escape the attention of scholars before, because of that underlying assumption that we have those movements on the one side of the politics and the state on the other side of politics.
Right. So thank you. I think that was very helpful, Grzegorz. Just adding on to what you have already pointed out is that so much of the research on social movements up to this point has looked at the protesters themselves, but very little has looked at the actual state structures, state actors, and so on, who have been in communication with them. And the state has been, for the most part, a kind of black box. Political parties and so forth, but we have very seldom looked at the ways in which top state leaders or parties in power have sometimes surreptitiously but very effectively organized protests, what seem to be protest movements, but in reality are also buttressing certain aspects of state power. And that's why we call this ruling by other means, trying to look at this from the perspective of the state rather than the perspective only of society. In the 1990s, when I was still teaching at Berkeley, I was part of a project that was led by Charles Tilly and Doug McAdam and Sid Tarrow, three giants in the field of social movements and contentious politics. And Chuck Tilly was also my own teacher at the University of Michigan. They were trying to really fundamentally rethink our theories of contentious politics and social movements, and they came out with a book called Dynamics of Contention, trying to make their theories more enlivened, to give them a sense of process that when social movements get underway, they change and so forth. But there was one thing that we really didn't touch in that almost decade in which together we and also Jack Goldstone and several other important theorists, Bill Sewell at Chicago, Ron Emmonsade at Minnesota, and that was really the state. And so we tried to make our theories more dynamic. We tried to bring in different kinds of social actors, but we tried to bring in emotions as well as logic. Gender became a very important aspect, but the state itself remains something of a black box. And I think what this project really tries to do is open up that black box a little bit. It's often very difficult because these movements sometimes are not transparent at all. And sometimes they're transnational as well. I think another very important point of our book is that we also have cases that focus on transnational state-mobilized movements, where one state sends either its people or its social media or other electronic resources out into another political territory and attempts to influence politics there. So in these areas, although we're really just a start at it, I think we really are, as Xiaojun suggested, opening up some very new terrain.
So one thing as somebody who doesn't specialize or read in this material all the time, but something that really struck me reading both the introductory essay, but also many of the other essays, and it became clearer, I think, in looking at the types of data that different authors were drawing upon in their research and how they were representing the state-mobilized movements. It seemed that Professor Perry just described this in terms of opening up a kind of a black box, and this raises this question of the kind of visibility versus the invisibility of these movements that really struck me and this comes up, I think, in chapter 2 quite clearly with Professor Ekiert's essay as well, where you describe this, what I thought it's the title of the essay. It was one of the more intriguing concepts in the volume 2 for me, which really made me think differently about so many of the movements that we kind of look at, but this notion of manufactured ambiguity. And I thought that this is can be such a devious form of a state mobilized movement that is very tricky to necessarily get one's some purchase on and able to research that. And so the question, I guess, is really more about how do we first of all, maybe you could explain a little bit this concept of manufactured ambiguity and this notion of how particularly authoritarian regimes can kind of mask their responsibilities for repression. I think we're all quite used to seeing large-scale mobilizations for crackdowns and things like that, but this that are quite visible to everyone. But what really struck me was these kind of attempts to, on behalf of the state, to remain invisible and to be this so-called invisible mover behind it, and the problem here, it seems to me, or at least the research question, is how does one actually study these? It seemed that for Professor Perry and Professor Yan's chapter, they had pretty good access to archival and material and data. On the other, and also for chapter 2 for you, Professor Ekiert, as well for Poland, access to archives. But it seemed as if some of the chapters had a harder time. I think Professor Lee's chapter 12 on Hong Kong was much more difficult to try to get to some of that archival data. So, so it's kind of a broad question, but how does one, if one acknowledges that there are these more visible and invisible forms of state-mobilized movements, how does one study these, I guess, as a researcher?
If I may start that, attempt to answer those very good questions. Now, I think, we did not discover a new continent. We all know from, long history that states were always trying to manipulate social actors for their advantage. Not only the state, but also the rich, affluent were mobilizing poor people to advance their interests and so on. So this is not something which is new and something which we didn't know before. But I think one could make two arguments here. First of all, the states today have much greater capacity to do those things. Both bureaucratic and resources and so on. And more the states are willing and happy to be involved in mobilizing publics for their own goals. We are familiar with the international domain, which Professor Perry mentioned, that domain is populated by various international organizations which lobby various other international organizations for a variety of things. And we know now that many of those organizations, although they pretend to be independent, are basically the tool of the state, which are used to lobby international bodies and prevent certain things from happening and so on and so on. So I think although this is not a new issue, I think now it becomes more and more important, both because of the capacity of the state, but also because of the global system in which various movements, organizations have much easier time to work across the state boundaries. Now, the question, of course, how we do that, because in most of those cases, the states are trying to cover their tracks. Right? They are trying to pretend that they have nothing to do with those movements and organizations. So I think it is the entire set of research techniques which we can employ studying various social movements. So in this volume, we see the protest event analysis, which is a very common way of studying social movements. We parts of other chapters are based on participatory observation, like people who studied movements in Hong Kong over the last several years. Some of those are based on analysis of literature and manifestos produced by movements and so on. So it's a lot of various techniques which can be used. Now the main point here is, and as you see, who are the authors of those chapters in this book, is that first of all we need a very deep contextual knowledge to be able to trace those often invisible things. So, for those chapters, we really needed specialists and experts on specific countries who spend years trying to, understand what's going on under, the surface of political life. And then depending on the availability of other techniques, can we do the public opinion polls on, and survey the leaders of the movements? Do we have access to archives and so on? Then those specialists have really much better sense of what's the range of possible techniques they can use.
Here, let me just add on a bit to what Grzegorz already said. As he pointed out, we have area specialists who are deeply knowledgeable about the areas they've been working on. Another important aspect, I think, of this volume is how interdisciplinary it is. So we have sociologists, political scientists, but also anthropologists. The study of the Nashi movement, I think, is particularly rich because Professor actually went and did detailed participant observation with those who are part of that movement, and it's really quite interesting. So that's one area. The other thing I would mention is that although Mark Beisinger is a political scientist, not a historian, his essay, I think, is really very important because he goes back to the 19th century kind of counter-revolutionary movements against those movements that so inspired Marx and other theorists of the late 19th and then on into the early 20th century, and points out that there were always counter-revolutionaries. And how do we think about these counter-revolutionaries? How do we reconceptualize them? And once we see those counter-revolutionaries as part of state-mobilized movements, that opens up a vast historical terrain for us, where there often is very rich archival material. So it may not be so easy to study Russia's involvement in America's 2016 election, but it is considerably easier to study the way in which the French Revolution mobilized the Vendée and so on. So that, I think, is one area that that we think about in slightly different terms, perhaps, after reconceptualizing these as state-mobilized movements. I think Xiaojun probably has some comments to make on it as well.
Yeah, particularly, Xiaojun, if I think this issue about how it seems, at least through the different movements in Hong Kong, where the PRC state was trying to infiltrate some of the popular organizations and things like that, is what really caught my eye, which was really, really eye-opening, I should say, for me to realize the reach inside of Hong Kong for those as well. But please, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you know about just possibilities for doing that kind of research in Hong Kong on those movements.
Yeah, I agree with what Professor Robson talked about at the very beginning of this question, that it's more difficult to find out the invisible hand of the state in contemporary state-mobilized movement than to find out the invisible hand of the state in the historical movements. So in the Hong Kong scene, I think both Liz and Grzegorz have mentioned very important things, like my colleague Eliza Lee, who is a leading scholar in Hong Kong politics. She has years of expertise and deep knowledge of the region. I think that's a very important sort of quality to of a scholar to do this kind of research with the minimum level of available information. And also, Eliza is herself a member of the electoral committee for the chief executive of Hong Kong, representing the Democratic faction. So I think she is herself part of the broader political processes. This will give her very deep knowledge of the political scene here in Hong Kong. So I think this kind of deeply knowledgeable about the regional politics, these kind of things are very, very important. And also interdisciplinary research is important. In the research of the state-mobilized movement in Hong Kong, I think investigative journalism plays a very important role, because so far we still have the freedom of press in Hong Kong. So I think the investigative journalism during the Occupy movement, especially the reports from those renowned media venues, provides a lot of deep information about who was behind a certain movement, who was the sponsor of a certain movement. So I think that kind of journalism also provides important information. But I think as time goes by, information will become more and more available. So at that time, it's another opportunity for us to probably revise our previous conclusion, or to enrich our previous observation of the state-mobilized movement in Hong Kong. I could not speak for my colleague, but I think all these important things are very crucial to doing research on the state-mobilized movement in contemporary politics.
Mm. Yeah, one of the things that, again, really struck me of reading these essays, first of all, just the diversity of the different types of state-mobilized movements. I mean, this is something that is really rich in the volume of just showing the varieties of possibilities for these. And I'll touch on that in just a minute. But in terms of these more invisible forms of manipulation, it seems to me there's a lot of the essays touch on this, and it would be a very, I think, fruitful path for future research as well, is just to see how the state is able to pull this off successfully in some cases and perhaps not in others. But what are the mechanisms for doing that to keep a low profile or a low sort of trail record? In other words, how do you bring people on board to support their interests without the kind of heavy-handed types of coercion that you spoke about earlier, which are, I think, part of more traditional theories of bringing people together to support, but actually how to do this in a way where it seems as if the state was not really involved, but in fact brought a mass movement on board to support their interests. That to me is that perhaps gets us even into, outside of just sociology and political science, even into psychology or something too, about how all of this kind of works. But do you have any, sense of looking over the range of things that are of movements that are represented from Hong Kong to Taiwan, China, Poland to Egypt in this volume, that might allow for some kind of generalizations there about how what makes some of those successful and some of them not?
I think there are a couple of points which are related to your comment. Now, it is very important to realize that things cannot be done from nothing. Right. So the states cannot mobilize people on their behalf in just absolutely artificial way by using coercion, by using terror and so on. In order for those movements to really appear, they need activists who share some of the ideas and some of the beliefs which are being mobilized. Right. So there's always an interesting interaction, and I think that many chapters in our book show that these are really people who believe that those ideas, those values are important, and then we see the state which is trying to enhance, amplify ideas, and so that's a very important point. This is not a devious state which has free hand to do whatever it wants. This is a very tricky interaction in which the state is tapping up some pre-existing sentiments, resentments, prejudices, and values and norms and so on. But that leads to another point, which I think is very important, because we always think more about why the state does it and what's in the state interest in it. But those types of action have unintended consequences. And I think many chapters in this book, many cases show that the state very often lands up not exactly in the place it wanted, because by mobilizing those movements, it somehow, releases a social energy, which at a certain point can turn against the state. So I think that the issue of unintended consequences is really very, very important here.
I would also add that the state, of course, is not an undifferentiated whole. And so what one element of the state is seeking in these movements may be at counter purposes with another element within the state. And similarly, when we come to determining whether these have been successful or not, there can be many, many different metrics for success here. Sometimes the state is hoping to carry out some kind of developmental campaign, and then we can perhaps objectively assess whether poverty was reduced or villages were modernized and so forth. But often the state is attempting to change people's thinking, to mobilize them emotionally and politically. And then it becomes very, very difficult to really assess how successful or unsuccessful this was. But I think there are many different means through which different states and different elements of the state do this. Sometimes by force of personality. In the chapter that Xiaojun and I focused on, we have the example of Mao in the Cultural Revolution using his charismatic authority and a variety of symbolic politics in order to develop a direct connection with ordinary people. But of course, China has been so successful at this kind of mobilization, not simply because it's had charismatic figures like Mao, but also because it has a whole history of campaign mobilization and a whole organizational infrastructure that has been developed to support campaign mobilization. And so when the state or parts of the state decide that they want to mobilize ordinary people, there is already there a kind of template of blueprint for how to do that. And one of the things that I find quite fascinating about this volume is the implication that East Asia may be particularly good at this sort of campaign mobilization. And that comes through in Kristen Looney's piece. She identifies as originating in Japan and then finding expression in South Korea, in the New Movement, the Seimal Undang, also in Taiwan, in the farmers' associations. And we see it in China in the Great Leap Forward and in the New Socialist Countryside movement as well. In all of those cases, somewhat different ideological bases, but all of them had organizational infrastructure that she identifies as a kind of campaign style of agricultural modernization that seems to be particularly well developed in East Asia.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I was really glad to see that in Kristen Looney's essay that she brought in a sort of a wider vantage point of East Asian material. Now, is particularly the Japan case really kind of jumped out to me, at least in terms of thinking of precedents or other examples of these kind of state mobilized movements, or something that's deeply ingrained to a certain type of politics and social movements there that that seemed, at least to an outsider, as something that there's a lot of precedent for. The question I had for her essay, actually in particular, in thinking about the case in Taiwan, but also Professor Yan brought up the essay that was done by David Palmer and Run Dongming on volunteerism, and that again, for somebody coming at this perhaps from a slightly outside perspective, is what actually defines a state mobilized movement, as opposed to, say, other types of terms that you've been using, like campaign or something else. Is there some distinction here? Because it seemed like the quality or the scale of these could be quite different in terms of the types of movements that that Professor Ekiert describes for Poland, or the ones we see for Egypt, Arab Spring type things, or some of these mass, just incredibly large scale type movements that are often temporally quite quick in terms of organization as well, versus long-term sort of planning as part of a campaign or something like that. These seem to be slightly different types of things. Is there some difference here in the way that we should think about these different types of strategies of the involvement of the state? And I think of mobilization as being something slightly different than, say, just state organization or state manipulation, perhaps, even if it's more nefarious. But anyway, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that, because it struck me as whether one calls volunteerism the same thing as a kind of large-scale movement or not. It was, at least for me, a question that came to my mind. So I know the author isn't here to sort of discuss that, but I'm wondering how you all as editors sort of manage these different styles of campaigns or volunteeristic movements and things like that.
I would say, we as editors really try to give quite a comprehensive definition of state mobilized movements, precisely for the reasons that you're suggesting here, that there are very important nuanced differences between short-lived and long-term movements, between ones in which there are developmental goals, other ones in which you're trying to put down other kinds of protest movements, yet other ones in which it's political parties who are mobilizing for their electoral fortunes and so forth. But we felt at this stage that it was important to have a big tent precisely so that we could start making those kinds of distinctions and figure out which ones are meaningful for what purposes. So when would we like to look at those that are really very short-term versus the ones that are long-term? When would we like to look at ones that are mobilized by a particular paramount leader as opposed to a political party or a faction of a political party? When would we want to look at those that have a developmental objective versus those that have a counter-protest objective and so forth? So we quite explicitly decided to build a big tent here. And that, of course, has downsides as well as upsides. But we felt that particularly because this was a relatively unexplored area, that we were better off including things that might seem to push the margins. There were certain areas, however, that we didn't want to go into, and that included military mobilization. For example, one can also, of course, see the formation of an army as a kind of state mobilized movement on the one side, and then those things on the other side that may be pro-state but really have no state involvement. So you also have on the other side those things that really are purely social movements, even though they're pro-state.
Just to add a little bit to what Liz just said, I think we developed a very simple typology of why those movements are being organized by the state. So, we mentioned that some of those mobilizations are reactive to events which happened. Some are sort of premeditated to prevent events from happening. We call this spoiler mobilization. Some are signaling to others that we don't like your policies. I think China is probably very precise about using movements as signaling devices, organizing protests, in front of the American embassies and Japanese embassies and so on, or boycotts of various kinds of Japanese products, for example. So that's very, very important element. And of course, some of those movements are organized to accomplish some infrastructural objectives, and these are the mobilization for specific economic and health issues, and so on. So that's there's a wide variety, and we were deliberately trying to cover as much territory as possible to show how various states are mobilizing movements for various things. Now, the second dimension of the story is whether these are movements which are fully from the very beginning organized by the state agents, or these are the movements which have been there, probably not very significant, but then somehow align yourself with the state and the goals of the state and so on. So again, we here have a number of possibilities, and probably the most successful of those movements are those which, on the one hand, as I mentioned before, have already presence on the ground, and some developed discourses and frames and systems of values and norms. And when those things are tapped by the state, that produces much more long-lasting and more important types of mobilization.
I think what Liz and Grzegorz said are all very important. I completely agree. I just want to add probably two things. One is that I think all these state mobilized movements we discuss in this book shared feature is the intentionality of the state, which means the state knows what is doing when the state decides to mobilize a movement. So there is a very clear agenda and purpose for most of the state mobilized movements. So I think the intentionality aspect is important. The other thing is that traditional social movement theory, the new social movement theory, tells us that the meaning construction is a very important feature of a social movement. So I think compared to a simple production campaign, probably in China or in the former Soviet Union, the state mobilized movements, they share features that they are trying to build up some meaning for the participants or for the society, or they try to deconstruct some sort of a meaning system. As Grzegorz said, that they want to attack some value or norms or this kind of things. So I think meaning construction could be another important aspect shared by all these state mobilized movements.
Mm-hmm. You're
great. Yeah,
like a sociologist.
Yes. Yeah, I was really glad that you raised this point about, because of the difference between what you might call the proactive and reactive types of movements. I found that a really, really interesting motif that ran across so many of the different essays, and also just thinking about how, I mean, this is so resonant with so many of the things going on in the U.S. right now, and the way that we have these different movements that we're watching develop under our very eyes, with whether they're Trump boat flotillas or car rallies, and then getting out, just the varieties of these, and then particularly what happened this past summer, just watching with all the Black Lives Matter protesting, but then what came out after that with the Blue Lives Matter, and which is quite interesting when one thinks about how the Hong Kong one split into yellow and blue as well. These are, the kind of international kind of symbolism and things like that went with it. And I think, this notion of getting a kind of buy-in by the people, and where a state mobilized mass movement can actually have the intention, that is to say, to do not always a nefarious one. I think this is also one thing that this volume points out, is to get away from just the kind of nefarious intent or coercive types of things. But once again, just to think of our recent politics here, when the Woodward interview came out with Trump, and people started reflecting about the different types of leadership involved with when one is withholding that data versus, say, a kind of Winston Churchill style of getting it all out there and trying to mobilize people to respond to a moment of need, where that kind of state mobilized movement can really be put towards a very positive or even constructive, and was also another thing that really struck me about how, by having this more capacious view that you have in this volume, I think it really does open up so many different areas that are really useful for thinking about the varieties of these, rather than just the kind of standard ones. I think that even for me as an outsider, both to the field, but also to the specific areas, things that we would know about just from reading history or news, but actually really probing in there to show the differences here. If it's okay with them, I had kind of two final things I'd like to touch on before. One of those is another theme that I saw a thread kind of running through, whether it was the East Asian example, the European, or even the South American ones, of the growing sense or interest in looking at the different types of technology and media, and in terms of how they're deployed in these state mobilized movements over time as well. And I was just curious if you had any reflection on that. It seems to me that this is something we're also seeing really transform the nature of social movements around the world. And again, how this information gets shared so quickly. I remember last fall with the Hong Kong movement, and then later on movements that were going on in Europe. I think it was the movements in Spain, where they actually were using the Hong Kong organizational software for their own organization, and they didn't even actually change anything. There were still things that were referring to Hong Kong, but they were just adopting the methods for their own protest movements, which I found this is really incredible how quickly it can get around the world. So any reflection just a little bit on this technology and media evolution in relationship to these movements?
I think I mentioned that in passing at the beginning, that probably the underlying technological change it is making this set of issues much more important. And I think, it's not only the technological change, but also the porousness of boundaries now between countries. I think that we see more and more foreign intervention into domestic politics, both in the US, but also in Europe. And we see more and more actors who are very much interested in that kind of intervention. And of course, Russia at this point and China are the main player in this field. So I think it's those two elements. First of all, the resources, the capacity to do those things, and then openness, which applies to both sides, right? You mentioned the imitation process, where the protesters in some countries are adopting the methods in other countries. I mean, Occupy Wall Street spread around the world in a very short period of time, and I think you now see this with the Black Lives Matter movements as well. You see the equivalence in various European countries and so on. So on the one hand, the real movements are imitating one another across the boundaries, but also the state actors are imitating one another in the little bit different dimension. I think, of course, there is a lot of mobilization for good and movements which are designed to do the good thing, but I think we have the natural tendency to worry about things which can have negative consequences and provide potential dangers to politics in many different parts of the world. So I think we have that bias to focus more on dangerous developments than on developments which are so more benign.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that notion of imitation across geographic national boundaries too. I know that in Liz and Xiaojun's essay, speculating a little bit about how much the Chinese knew about what had been happening in Poland was something that really definitely caught my eye as well. Even in the late 1960s, that information flows. We think of things so rapid now, but things were happening at that time where knowledge seems to have been shared, quite quickly around the world, and leaders paying quite close attention to that and seeing the possibilities and perhaps warnings about what was and wasn't working is a really interesting thing to ponder. So
another thing, of course, that comes with this new technology is the relative ease of disguising the origin. Mm-hmm. So that also further complicates these things. We often don't know who is Q of QAnon. We have really very little idea. And yet it now has taken on a life of its own that's extremely important politically. And we're finding more and more of these movements where either purposely or simply by virtue of being retweeted so many times and so on, we lose a sense of where the origin came from. And I think that further complicates this question of mobilizing by stealth. We also don't have a very good sense on what the differences are of mobilizing in person versus mobilizing digitally. There is still a lot of controversy over the Arab Spring of how much social media really played a role and what role at what stages in that movement. Initially a lot of excitement that social media was very democratizing by giving everyone a voice, allowing everyone to participate. People in very far-flung regions could all be mobilized. Then realizing that, in fact, the state could perhaps more effectively deploy this resource than dispersed social actors, but also realizing that once the state turned off everyone's social media accounts, and they had to mobilize in person, and that created a new kind of network power that was not really replicated virtually or remotely online. So I think there is a lot here that we still need to explore, and it's a very important area of further research.
Yeah, I also think technology is so important in the latest protest scene. I just want to add one very interesting thing is that in the Hong Kong protest scene, we often see that the protesters are always one step ahead in terms of using advanced technology than the state-mobilized movements. This I myself thinks about this. Quite often, I thought it's probably because of the limitation of a bureaucracy, because state mobilized movement has to go through the bureaucracy. So there's a certain limitation of bureaucracy about how fast it can adopt a certain new technology. And also there might be different level of need of secret means of communication between state mobilized movements and the protesters. But anyway, what we see is that the protesters always a step ahead, and the state mobilized movements are lagged behind in terms of using advanced technologies. So I think I agree with Liz and Grzegorz that this is a very important field for future research.
That's a really interesting point about the popular movement staying just one step ahead, or how the state has a hard time, I would imagine, sometimes really tapping in. I think, Grzegorz' point about it needing to have some kind of seeds or roots there before it can actually catch on or something. It needs that to have a more likelihood of success. I mean, it sort of reminded me when I was reading some of these about the efforts at state, mobilization to, say, a large corporation that's going to have a funny hat day or something like that, and it turns out that obviously nobody really thinks it's funny. It's just a kind of a flop and a sort of a sad cry for trying to be innovative or do something different. And it seems to me we find the state often in those kind of positions where they're trying in the wrong ways, because they are, I think, as Xiaojun quite rightly pointed out, often sort of behind the wave or lagging somehow. Which brings to mind maybe a final question here. Perhaps each of you could mention your favorite example of a failed state-mobilized movement, or an attempted one that just utterly flopped or was not successful, or perhaps even was counterproductive to the state.
I suppose that the historical ground is littered with failed state-mobilized movements. Some of those never took off the ground, and despite the resources and those other things, the state, as much as movement entrepreneurs, are trying all the time, right? This process of coming up with different framings, with different ideas, with different grievances, and so on and so on. And very few real social movements succeed. It's most of movements fail one way or another, and I think the same thing is happening on the other side. I think in our book, which I like the most as an example of what you had in mind, is that youth movement in Russia.
Yeah,
and I think it's very nice chapter which really introduces a lot of interesting ideas because of this very deep anthropological research on the ground. But this movement really changed the motivation of participants. The state predicted that there will be such simple tools to bring to Moscow by bus and organize counter protests against the opposition activists and so on. But those people started to really kind of think in some new ways about what's their role in society, what they're supposed to do, and this mobilization of different meaning, as Xiaojun mentioned, was very important. And things reached the moment in which the state had to shut this down, right? Because it was slowly getting out of hand, trying to be involved in things the state didn't want them to be involved, and so on. So I think this is an excellent case in the book of those unintended consequences and why the state is failing quite often in mobilizing those forces behind itself.
So my favorite flop is the New Life movement of the Guamindang. We think of, the KMT today as being really quite good at social mobilization. Taiwan has shown this. Kristen Looney in her chapter looks at the Farmers Association. We can look today at Taiwan's handling of COVID-19, one of really the best success stories so far internationally. But if we go back to the 1930s and look at that much earlier effort, perhaps the biggest kind of first effort on the part of the KMT to get people to stop spitting in the streets and to clean up their public behavior and so forth. That Confucian effort to get people to take public morality seriously really did not work. The New Life movement, I think, is a kind of historical laughing stock. People point fun at it, although of course it had a dark side. Fred Wakeman has referred to it as a kind of Confucian fascism. And certainly it had a militaristic side, organizing the blue shirts, Chiang Kai-shek's equivalent of the brown shirts and the black shirts. But it also had this sort of pathetic effort to clean up public morality that went nowhere. And so I think it's an interesting story. Obviously, Taiwan is a tiny island compared to mainland China, and it became much easier for the KMT to mobilize in that much smaller environment. But I think they also learned a certain amount from their previous mistakes. And looking at those failed efforts in a state's history, I think is important for understanding the lessons that it may have learned in improving its efforts at social mobilization.
Yeah, one of the failed efforts came to my mind is the anti-spiritual pollution movement in the 1980s in China, by which the Communist Party leadership wanted to get rid of the so-called Western style lifestyle and as well as discourse. But this sort of state mobilized movement is very short-lived. It's like only several months and it's gone. So from this failed effort, I think it's important that a successful state mobilized movement has to be in sort of in harmony with the sort of a larger political climate of the time. Well, in the early 1980s, China was in a sort of on the high tide of open up and reform. So the entire political climate is towards liberalization. So this kind of a conservative and sort of a conservative hardliner movement cannot stay long. And also it involves the mobilization itself. Because as we mentioned just now in passing, that for a successful state mobilized movement, the state mobilizes social groups selectively. It has to have a sort of allies in the society. While the anti-spiritual pollution movement does not have any sort of supporters or a certain a social group whose interest is similar to those who decided to initiate this movement. So while the state has to selectively mobilize the social movement, it has to have this kind of social base at first. If without a certain social base, sort of the effort of state mobilized movement cannot be a successful one. That's my...
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. Actually, I mean, I think the role of studying failed movements can actually bring into clearer focus why certain ones are more successful as well. But also how even when everything else is in place, how there's not an inevitable success either. I mean, clearly what I learned a lot from this book was just the amount of strategic formation, even infrastructure that's necessary, and precision by the state in order to be successful with these types of movements, but all the while trying to sort of mask over some of that to make the ones that seem to be most successful look as if they are kind of spontaneous, or that they're really a welling up of people's sentiment and things like that. And that's a hard thing to orchestrate, it seems to me, and isn't. And are there examples, like, this isn't a question for you necessarily, but just speculating, are there examples of these kind of spontaneous movements for the state that where actually the state was kind of capitalizing on it, but not necessarily the hand constructing it and really trying to foment it, but actually just really seeing it as a possibility. So I think for me, again, just one of the real contributions of this volume, and as Grzegorz pointed out at the beginning, that this is a thematic. It's not an area focusing on any particular area, and that really brings together, I think, its strength for what it at least brings to this topic of state-mobilized movements, is that by looking all the way around the world, from Europe to East Asia, South Asia, even, and we can't talk in North America as well, that all of those particular case studies then bring something new to this conceptualization of these state-mobilized movements that in total, I think, really helps to provide a lot more fine-grained and fine-tuning of this concept and a wider range of possibilities of what to look for, what to be aware of as one studies these. And each of them presents their own challenges, obviously, in terms of data, in terms of access to materials, all kinds of challenges for studying those. But for me, it was really, again, something that just completely, in many ways, just beginning with it, to be honest, was very counterintuitive, sort of flipping almost of my own preconceptions about large-scale political movements in general. And I learned a tremendous amount just to see how the state was much more involved in a lot of these. And it's not that it shouldn't have been surprising to me. We see it once you attune your kind of perspective to it, you see it going on basically on a daily basis here, particularly in the U.S. right now. And I imagine that as we head into this election season over the next month, that we're going to see perhaps even more of this. And I feel like I have some conceptual tools now to sort of look around and try to see what's going on, as you read these types of events that we see in the newspaper every day now. So I just end by thanking you all for taking the time today to speak with me, and also for the contribution of this collection of essays. It's a really, each of them had its own real engaging and substantive amount of information that I learned a tremendous amount from. So thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much.
Thank you.